Part 2. The Nature of Wealth. Chapter 1. Confusions as to the meaning of wealth. The purpose of the science of political economy is, as we have seen, the investigation of the laws that govern the production and distribution of wealth in social or civilized life. In beginning our study, our first step is therefore to examine the nature of the wealth of societies or communities, to determine exactly what we mean by the term wealth when used in political economy. There are few words in more common use than the word wealth, and in the general way that suffices for ordinary purposes, we all know what we mean by it. But when it comes to defining that meaning with the precision necessary for the purposes of political economy, so as to determine what is and what is not properly included in the idea of wealth as political economy must treat of it, most of us, though we often and easily use the word in ordinary thought and speech, are apt to become conscious of indefiniteness and perplexity. This is not strange. Indeed, it is a natural result of the transference to a wider economy of the term we are accustomed to use in a narrower economy. In our ordinary talk and speech, referring, as it most frequently does, to everyday affairs and the relations of individuals with other individuals, the economy with which we are usually concerned and have most frequently in mind is individual economy, not political economy. The economy whose standpoint is that of the unit, not the economy whose standpoint is that of the social whole or social organism. The original meaning of the word wealth is that of plenty or abundance, that of the possession of things conducive to a certain kind of weal or well-being. Health, strength, and wealth express three kinds of wealth or well-being. In the economy of individuals or social units, everything is regarded as wealth, the possession of which tends to give wealthiness, or the command of external things that satisfy desire to its individual possessor, even though it may involve the taking of such things from other individuals. But in the other economy, that of social wholes or the social organism, nothing can be regarded as wealth that does not add to the wealthiness of the whole. An individual, for instance, may be wealthy by virtue of obligations due to him from other individuals, but such obligations constitute no part of the wealth of the society, which includes both debtor and creditor. Or an individual may increase his wealth by robbery or by gaming, but the wealth of the social whole, which comprises robbed as well as robber, loser as well as winner, cannot be thus increased. It is, therefore, no wonder that men accustomed to use the word wealth in its ordinary sense, a sense in which no one can avoid its continual use, should be liable, unless they take great care to slip into confusion when they come to use the same word in its economic sense. But what does seem strange is that indefiniteness, perplexity, and confusion as to the meaning of the economic term wealth are even more obvious in the writings of professional economists. Adam Smith, who is regarded as the founder of the modern science of political economy, is not very definite or entirely consistent as to the real nature of the wealth of nations, or wealth in the economic sense. But since his time, the confusion of which he shows traces, instead of being cleared up by the writings of those who in our schools and colleges are recognized as political economists, has become progressively so much worse confounded that in the latest and most elaborate of these treatises, all attempts to define the term seem to have been abandoned. Many of the best-known writers on political economy make no attempt to give any definition of wealth. The same thing is to be said of the 2 volumes of Karl Marx entitled Das Kapital, and also of the 2 volumes on the same subject by Boehm-Bawerk, which are much quoted by that now dominant school of scholastic political economy known as the Austrian. And while many other writers, who make no attempt to define wealth, do have a good deal to say about it, what they say is too diffused and incoherent either to quote or condense. There are many who, without saying so, evidently hold the opinion thus frankly expressed by Professor Perry in his Elements of Political Economy, 1866,
This word wealth has been the bane of political economy. It is the bog whence most of the mists have arisen, which have beclouded the whole subject. From its indefiniteness and the variety of associations it carries along with it in different minds, it is totally unfit for any scientific purpose whatever. It is itself almost impossible to be defined, and consequently can serve no useful purpose in the definition of anything else. The meaning of the word wealth has never been settled, and if political economy must wait until that work is done as a preliminary, the science will never be satisfactorily constructed. Men may think and talk and write and dispute till doomsday, but until they come to use words with definiteness and mean the same thing by the same word, they reach comparatively few results and make but little progress. And it is just at this point that we find the first grand reason of the slow advance hitherto made by this science. It undertook to use the word for scientific purposes, which no amount of manipulation and explanation could make suitable for that service. Happily, there is no need to use this word. In emancipating itself from the word wealth as a technical term, political economy has dropped a clog, and its movements are now relatively free.
Now, wealth is the object noun, or name given to the subject matter, of political economy, the science that seeks to discover the laws of the production and distribution of wealth in human society. It is therefore the economic term of the first importance. Unless we know what wealth is, how can we possibly hope to discover how it is procured and distributed? Yet after a century of what passes for the cultivation of the science, with professors of political economy in every college, the question, what is wealth, finds no certain answer. Even to such questions as, is wealth material or immaterial? Or, is it something external to man, or does it include man and his attributes? We get no undisputed reply. There is not even a consensus of opinion. And in the latest and most pretentious scholastic teaching, the attempt to obtain any has been virtually, where not definitely, abandoned, and the economic meaning of wealth reduced to that of anything having value to the social unit. It is clear that failure to define its subject matter or object noun must be fatal to any attempted science, for it shows a lack of the first essential of a true science. And the fate of rejection, even by those who profess to study and teach it, has already befallen political economy at the hands of the accredited institutions of learning. This fact will not be obvious to the ordinary reader, for it is concealed from him under a change in the meaning of a word. Chapter 2. Causes of confusion as to the meaning of wealth. Since the term comes into our language from the Greek, the proper word for expressing the idea of relationship to political economy is politico-economic. But this is a term too long and too alien to the Saxon genius of our mother tongue for frequent repetition. And so the word economic has come into accepted use in English, expressing that idea. We are justified, therefore, in supposing, and as a matter of fact, to generally suppose when we first hear of them, that the works now written by the professors of political economy in our universities and colleges, and entitled Elements of Economics, or Principles of Economics, are treatises on political economy. Examination, however, will show that many of these are at least not in reality treatises on the science of political economy, but treatises on what their authors might better call the science of exchanges, or the science of exchangeable quantities. This is not the same thing as political economy, but quite a different thing. A science, in short, akin to the science of mathematics. In this, there is no necessity for distinguishing between what is wealth to the unit and what is wealth to the whole, and moral questions that must be met in a true political economy may be easily avoided by those to whom they seem awkward. A proper name for this totally different science, which the professors of political economy in so many of the leading colleges and universities on both sides of the Atlantic have now substituted in their teaching for the science they are officially supposed to expound, would be that of catalactics, as proposed by Archbishop Whately, or that of plutology, as proposed by Professor Hearn of Melbourne. But it is certainly not properly economics, for that by long usage is identified with political economy. The neglect of political economy in the classical world has been explained by modern economists as due to the effect of slavery in causing labor to be regarded as degrading. But, in this, a quicker and more direct effect of slavery in preventing the cultivation of political economy has been overlooked. Except perhaps as the crucified fomenter of a servile rebellion, the only class in which any philosopher of the ancient world might have got a hearing that could have brought his name and teachings down to us was the wealthy class, whose riches were largely in their slaves. For any social condition in which privilege and wealth are inequitably distributed, what Jefferson said of Jesus must be true of all moral or economic teachers. All the learned of his country, entrenched in its power and riches, were opposed to him, lest his labors should undermine their advantages. The first question that a coherent political economy must answer is, what is wealth? This, in a state of society in which the ruling class were universally slaveholders, was too delicate a question for any accredited philosopher to have fairly met. Even the most astute among them could do no further than to say, with the intellectual giant Aristotle, that wealth is all things whose value is measured by money, or with the Roman jurist Ulpian, that is wealth which can be bought and sold. From this point, the very point to which our modern political economy has in current scholastic teachings now come again. Though there may be economies of finance and economies of exchanges, there was and could be no political economy. But this indisposition to recognize the distinction between what may be wealth to the individual and what is wealth to the society, which has prevented the growth of any science of political economy, has not ceased to show itself with the abolition of chattel slavery, only one of the means by which individuals become wealthy without increase in the general wealth. As it has, in modern civilization, lost importance, other means to the same end have taken its place. But wherever and from whatever causes society is divided into the very rich and very poor, the primary question of political economy, what is wealth, must be a delicate one to men sensibly or insensibly influenced by the feelings and opinions of the dominating class. For in such social conditions, much that commonly passes for wealth must really be only legalized robbery, and nothing can be more offensive to those enjoying the profit of robbery than to call it by its true name. In the preliminary remarks to his Principles of Political Economy, John Stuart Mill says,
"It often happens that the universal belief of one age of mankind, a belief from which no one was, nor without an extraordinary effort of genius and courage, could at that time be free, becomes to a subsequent age so palpable an absurdity that the only difficulty then is to imagine how such a thing can ever have appeared credible. It has so happened with the doctrine that money is synonymous with wealth. The conceit seems too preposterous to be thought of as a serious opinion. It looks like one of the crude fancies of childhood, instantly corrected by a word from any grown person. But let no one feel confident that he should have escaped the delusion if he had lived at the time when it prevailed."
Let no one be confident indeed. Yet it is a mistake to liken the absurdities of the mercantile or protective system to the crude fancies of childhood. This has never been their origin or their strength. In the petty commerce in marbles and tops that goes on among schoolboys, no boy ever imagined that the more he gave and the less he got in such exchange, the better off he should be. No primitive people were ever so stupid as to suppose that they could increase their wealth by taxing themselves. Any child who could understand the proposition would see that $1 worth of gold could not be more valuable than $1 worth of anything else. Such ideas are not the fantasies of childhood. Their strength, their persistence, is due to the growth of special interests and artificial restrictions on trading as a means of increasing individual wealth at the expense of the general wealth. The power of a special interest, though inimical to the general interest, so to influence thought as to make fallacies pass as truths, is a great fact, without which neither the political history of our own time and people nor that of other times and peoples can be understood. A comparatively small number of individuals brought into virtual, though not necessarily formal, agreement of thought and action by something that makes them individually wealthy without adding to the general wealth may exert an influence out of all proportion to their numbers. A special interest of this kind is, to the general interests of society, as a standing army is to an unorganized mob. It gains intensity and energy in its specialization, and in the wealth it takes from the general stock, finds power to mold opinion. Leisure and culture, and the circumstances and conditions that command respect, accompany wealth, and intellectual ability is attracted by it. On the other hand, those who suffer from the injustice that takes from the many to enrich the few are, in that very thing, deprived of the leisure to think, and the opportunities, education, and graces necessary to give their thought acceptable expression. They are necessarily the unlettered, the ignorant, the vulgar, prone in their consciousness of weakness to look out for leadership and guidance to those who have the advantages that the possession of wealth can give. Now, if we consider it, injustice and absurdity are simply different aspects of incongruity. That which to right reason is unjust must be, to right reason, absurd. But an injustice that impoverishes the many to enrich the few shifts the centers of social power, and thus controls the social organs and agencies of opinion and education. Growing in strength and acceptance by what it feeds on, it has only to continue to exist to become at length so vested or rooted in that constitution of opinions, beliefs, and habits of thought which we take from our social environment, that it is not perceived as injustice or uncertainty, but seems even to the philosopher as an integral part of the natural order. When an incongruous substance, such as, for instance, a bullet, is implanted in the human body, the physical system, as soon as it despairs of its removal, sets about the endeavor to accommodate itself to the incongruity, frequently with such success that at length the incongruity is not noticed. The stout, masterful man with whom I have just now been talking, and whom you might liken to a bull were it not for the intelligence of his face, has long carried a bullet under his skin. And men have even been known to live for years with bullets in their brains. So, too, with philosophical systems. When an incongruity is accepted in a philosophical system, the abilities of its professors are at once set to work to accommodate other parts of the system to the incongruity, frequently with such success that philosophical systems containing fatal incongruities have been known to command acceptance for long generations. Indeed, the artificialities and confusions by which an incongruity is made tolerable to a philosophic system, for the very reason that they cannot be understood except by those who have submitted their minds to a special course of cramping, become to them a seeming evidence of superiority, gratifying a vanity like that of the contortionist, who has painfully learned to walk a little way on his hands instead of his feet, and to twist his body into unnatural and unnecessary positions, or like that of the conveyancer or lawyer, who has in the same way painfully learned to perform such tricks with language. This, I think, is what was meant in the concise but deep philosophy of Christ by such sayings as that the kingdom of heaven, or system of right doing, though revealed unto babes, is hidden from those deemed wise and prudent, and that what the common people heard gladly was foolishness to the learned scribes and Pharisees. But not to depart from the matter in hand, it is evident that the efforts of able men to bring into some semblance of coherence the system of political economy, destitute of any clear and coherent definition of wealth, must have surrounded the subject with greater perplexities and helped powerfully to prevent the need of a definition of wealth from being felt. This is precisely what we see when we examine the different attempts to define wealth in the economic sense, and note the increasing confusions that have attended them, culminating in the acceptance of the common meaning of the word wealth, anything that has exchangeable power, as the only meaning that can be given to the economic term, and the consequent abandonment of the possibility of a science of political economy. Nor can this power of a great pecuniary interest to affect thought, and especially to affect thought in those circles of society whose opinions are most respected, ever be done away with save by the abolition of its cause, the social adjustment or institution that gives power to obtain wealth without earning it. The pecuniary interest in the ownership of slaves was never very large in the United States, but it so dominated the thought of the whole country that up to the outbreak of the Civil War, the term abolitionist was to good, kindly, and intelligent people, even in the North, an expression that meant everything vile and wicked. And whatever else might have been the issue of the war, had the pecuniary interest in the maintenance of slavery remained, it would still have continued to show itself in thought. But as soon as the supplies of the slave-owning interest were cut off by the freeing of the slaves, this power upon opinions vanished. Now, no preacher, professor, or politician, even in the South, would think of advocating or defending slavery. And in Boston, where he narrowly escaped mobbing, stands a public statue of William Lloyd Garrison. Chapter 3. Adam Smith and the French Physiocrats. If, considering the increasing indefiniteness among professed economists as to the nature of wealth, we compare Adam Smith's great book with the treatises that have succeeded it, we may observe on its very title page something usually unnoticed but really very significant. Adam Smith does not propose an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth, but an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. These words have become the descriptive title of the book. Yet the limiting words, of nations, seem to have been little noticed and less understood by the writers who, in increasing numbers for almost 100 years, have taken this great book as a basis for their elucidations and supposed improvements. Their assumption seems to be that it is wealth generally, or wealth without limitation, which Adam Smith treats of, and which is the proper subject of political economy, and that if he meant anything by his determining words, of nations, he referred to such political divisions as England, France, Holland, etc. Yet it is certain that what he meant by the wealth of nations, of the nature and causes of which he proposed to inquire, was something essentially different from what is meant by wealth in the ordinary sense of the word, which includes as well everything that may give wealth to the individual. It was that kind of wealth the production of which increases and the destruction of which decreases the wealth of society as a whole, which he sought to distinguish from the word wealth in its common or individual sense by the limiting words of nations, in the meaning not of the larger political divisions of mankind, but of societies or social organisms. It has been much complained of Adam Smith that he does not define what he means by wealth, but this has been exaggerated. In the very first paragraph of the introduction to his work, he thus explains what he means by the wealth of nations, the only sense of the word wealth, which it is the business of what is properly called political economy to consider.
The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessities and conveniences of life which it annually consumes, and which consists always either in the immediate produce of that labor or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations.
Again, in the last sentence of this introduction, he speaks of the real wealth, the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. And in other places throughout the book, he also speaks of this wealth of society, or wealth of nations, or real wealth, as the produce of land and labor. Through the first and most important part of his work, this is the idea which Smith has constantly in mind, and to which he constantly adheres in tracing all production of wealth to labor. But having grasped this idea of the nature of wealth without having clearly defined its relation to other ideas is still lying in his mind, he falls into the subsequent confusion of also classing personal qualities and debts as wealth. Quesnay and the Physiocrats. François Quesnay, a French philosopher, was born on June 4, 1694, 28 years before Adam Smith, at Mercy, some 10 leagues from Paris. Beginning life in the manual labor of the farm, he was without either the advantages or, as they often prove to men of parts, the disadvantages of a scholastic education. With much effort, he taught himself to read, became apprenticed to a surgeon, and at length began practice for himself at Mantes, where he acquired some means and came to the knowledge of Marshal de Noailles, who spoke of him to the Queen, who in her turn recommended him to the King. He finally settled in Paris, bought the place of physician to the King, and was made by the monarch his first physician. Abstaining from the intrigues of the court, he won the sincere respect of Louis XV, with whom, as his first physician, he was brought into close personal contact. The king made him a noble, gave him a coat of arms, assigned him apartments in the palace, calling him affectionately his thinker, and had his books printed in the royal printing office. And around him, in his apartments in the palace of Versailles, this king's thinker was accustomed to gather a group of eminent men who joined him in the grandest aim the human mind can entertain, nothing less than the establishment of liberty and the abolition of poverty among man by the confirmation of human laws to the natural order intended by the Creator. These men saw what has often been forgotten amid the complexities of a high civilization, but is yet as clear as the sun at noonday to whoever considers first principles. They saw that there is but one source on which men can draw for all their material needs, land, and that there is but one means by which land can be made to yield to their desires, labor. All real wealth, they therefore saw, is the result or product of the application of labor to land. They had not only grasped this first principle, from which any true economy, even that of the savage tribe or an isolated individual, must start, but they had grasped the central principle of a true political economy. This is the principle that in the natural growth of the social organism into which men are integrated in society, there is developed a fund which is the natural provision for the natural needs of that organism, a fund which is not merely sufficient for all the material wants of society, and may be taken for that purpose, its intended destination, without depriving the unit of anything rightfully his, but which must be so taken to prevent the gravest injuries to individuals and the direst disasters to the state. This fund, Quesnay and his followers styled the produit net, the net, or surplus, or remaining product. They called it this, evidently because they saw it as something which remained, attached, as it were, to the control of land, after all the expenses of production that were resolvable into compensation for the exertion of individual labor are paid. What they really meant by the produit net is precisely what is properly understood in English by the word rent, when used in the special sense which it has acquired since Ricardo's time as a term of political economy. In grasping the real meaning and intent of the net product, or economic rent, there was opened to the physiocrats a true system of political economy, a system of harmonious order and beneficent purpose. They had grasped the key, without which no true science of political economy is possible, and from the refusal to accept which the scholastic economy that has succeeded Adam Smith is, after nearly 100 years of cultivation, during which it has sunk into the contemptible position of the dismal science, now slipping into confessed incompetency and rejection. But, misled by defective observation and a habit of thought that prevailed long after them, and indeed yet largely prevails, the physiocrats failed to perceive that economic rent may attach to land used for any purpose. Looking for some explanation in natural law of what was then doubtless generally assumed to be fact, that agriculture is the only occupation which yields to the landlord an unearned increment, rent, they not unnaturally, under the circumstances, hit upon a striking difference between agriculture, which grows things, and the mechanical and trading occupations, which merely change things in form, place, or ownership, as furnishing the explanation for which they sought. This difference lies in the use which agriculture makes of the generative or reproductive principle in nature. This supposed fact, and what seemed to them the rational explanation of it, the physiocrats expressed in their terminology by styling agriculture the only productive occupation. All other occupations, however useful, they regarded as sterile or barren. They assumed that such occupations give rise to no net product or unearned increment, merely returning again to the general fund of wealth, or gross product, the equivalent of what they had taken from it, changing the form, place, or ownership of material things already in existence. This was their great and fatal misapprehension, since it has been effectually used to discredit their whole system. Still, it was not really a vital mistake. That is to say, it made no change in their practical proposals. The followers of Quesnay insisted that agriculture, in which they admitted fisheries and mines, was the only productive occupation, or in other words, the only application of labor that added to the sum of wealth, while manufactures and exchange, though useful, were sterile, merely changing the form or place of wealth without adding to its sum. They, however, proposed no restrictions or disabilities whatever on the occupations they thus stigmatized. On the contrary, they were, which the so-called English free traders who have followed Adam Smith never yet have been, free traders in the full sense of the term. In their practical proposition, the single tax, they proposed the only means by which the free trade principle can ever be carried to its logical conclusion. The freedom not merely of trade, but of all other forms and modes of production, with full freedom of access to the natural element which is essential to all production. They were the authors of the motto that is in the English use of the phrase laissez-faire. Let things alone has been so emasculated and perverted, but which on their lips was laissez-faire, laissez-aller, clear the ways and let things alone. This is said to come from the cry that in medieval tournaments gave the signal for combat. The English motto which I take to come closest to the spirit of the French phrase is a fair field and no favor. Adam Smith and the Physiocrats. The resemblance of the views expressed in Adam Smith's work to those held by the Physiocrats has been noticed by all critics, and both on the side of their opponents and their advocates, there have not been wanting intimations that Smith borrowed from them. It is a mistake to which the critics who are themselves mere compilers are liable, to think that men must draw from one another to see the same truths or to fall into the same errors. Truth is, in fact, a relation of things which is to be seen independently because it exists independently. Error is perhaps more likely to indicate transmission from mind to mind, yet even that usually gains its strength and permanence from misapprehensions that in themselves have independent plausibility. Such relations of the stars as that appearance in the north which we call the Dipper or Great Bear, or as that in the south which we call the Southern Cross, are seen by all who scan the starry heavens, though the names by which men know them are various. And to think that the sun revolves around the earth is an error into which the testimony of their senses must cause all men independently to fall, until a first testimony of the senses is corrected by reason applied to wider observations. In what is most important, I have come closer to the views of Kenney and his followers than did Adam Smith, who knew the men personally, but in my case, there was certainly no derivation from them. I well recall the day when, checking my horse on a rise that overlooked San Francisco Bay, the commonplace reply of a passing teamster to a commonplace question crystallized, as by lightning flash, my brooding thoughts into coherency, and I there and then recognized the natural order. One of those experiences that make those who have had them feel that they can vaguely appreciate what mystics and poets have called the ecstatic vision. Yet at that time I had never heard of the physiocrats, or even read a line of Adam Smith. Afterwards, with a great idea of the natural order in my head, I printed a little book, Our Land and Land Policy, in which I urged that all taxes should be laid on the value of land, irrespective of improvements. Casually meeting on a San Francisco street, a scholarly lawyer, we stopped to chat, and he told me that what I had in my little book proposed was what the French economists, 100 years before, had proposed. I forget many things, but the place where I heard this, and the tones and attitude of the man who told me of it, are photographed on my memory. For when you have seen a truth that those around you do not see, it is one of the deepest of pleasures to hear of others who have seen it. What Adam Smith meant by the wealth of nations is in most cases, and wherever he is consistent, the material things produced from land by labor which constitute the necessities and conveniences of human life. The aggregate produce of society, using the word produce as expressive of the sum of material results, in the same way that we speak of agricultural produce, of factory produce, of the produce of mines or fisheries, or the chase. Now this is what the physiocrats meant by wealth, or as they sometimes termed it, the gross product of land and labor. But this is also, as I shall hereafter show, the primary or root meaning of the word wealth in its common use. And whoever will read Smith's Considerations Concerning the First Formation of Languages, originally published with his Moral Sentiments in 1759, will see from his manner of tracing words to their primary uses, that whenever he came to think of it, he would have recognized the original and true meaning of the word wealth to be that of the necessities and conveniences of human life, brought into being by the exertion of labor upon land. The difference between Smith and the physiocrats is this. The physiocrats, on their part, clearly laid down and steadily contended that nothing that did not have material existence or was not produced from land, could be included in the category of the wealth of society. Adam Smith, however, with seeming inadvertence, has fallen in places into the inconsistency of classing personal qualities and obligations as wealth. This is probably attributable to the fact that what seemed to him possible to accomplish was much less than the physiocrats aimed at. The task to which he set himself, that in the main of showing the absurdity and impolicy of the mercantile or protective system, was sufficiently difficult to make him comparatively regardless of speculations that led far beyond it. With the disapproval of the current notion that the wealth of nations consists of the precious metals, his care as to what is and what is not a part of that wealth relaxed. He went with the physiocrats in their condemnation of the attempts of governments to check commerce, but stopped both where they had carried the idea of freeing all production from tax or restraint to the point of a practical proposition, and where they had fallen into obvious error. He neither proposed the single tax, nor did he fall into the mistake of declaring agriculture the only productive occupation. That there is a natural order, he saw, and that to this natural order our perceptions of justice conform, he also saw. But that involved in this natural order is a provision for the material needs of advancing society. He seems never to have seen. There are passages in The Wealth of Nations where Adam Smith checks his inquiry with a suddenness that shows an indisposition to venture on ground that the possessing classes would deem dangerous. But in nothing he left after him, just before his death, he destroyed all manuscripts he did not wish published. There is an indication that he was more than puzzled by the attempt of the physiocrats to explain the great truth that they saw with wrong apprehension. He clearly perceived that the produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor, and that it was the appropriation of land that had deprived the laborer of his natural due. But he had evidently never looked further into the phenomena of rent than to see that the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed. He passes over the great subject of the relations of men to the land they inhabit, as though the appropriation by a few of what nature has provided as a dwelling place and storehouse of all must now be accepted as if it were part of the natural order. And so, indeed, in his times and conditions, it must have appeared to him. That Adam Smith, all-round man that he was, possessed both the prudence of the man and the prudence of the philosopher, is shown by the fact that he managed to do what he did, without arousing in a greater degree the ire of the defenders of vested wrongs. Whoever will intelligently read The Wealth of Nations will find it full of radical sentiment, an arsenal from which lovers of liberty and justice may still draw weapons for victories remaining to be won. Yet its author was a college professor, traveling tutor of a duke, held a lucrative government position, and died Lord Rector of Glasgow University. For the present times at least, the Scotsman succeeded where the Frenchman failed. It is he, not Quesnay, who has come down to us as the father of political economy. Chapter 4. Development of the Scholastic Political Economy. When the first few copies of my Progress and Poverty were printed in an author's edition in San Francisco, a large landowner, the late General Beale, proprietor of the Tejon Ranch, and afterwards the United States Minister to Austria, sought me to express the pleasure with which he had read it as an intellectual performance. This, he said, he had felt at liberty to enjoy, for to speak with the freedom of philosophic frankness, he was certain my work would never be heard of by those whom I wished it to affect. In the same way, but to a much greater degree, the small class that alone The Wealth of Nations could first reach were able to enjoy its greatness as an intellectual performance that widened the circle of thought. Few of them were disturbed by any fear of its ultimate effect on special interests. At that time, a popular press was not yet in existence, and books of this kind were addressed only to the superior orders. The House of Commons, the nominal representative of the unprivileged in Great Britain, was filled by the appointees of the great landowners, and the oligarchy that ruled in the British Islands was really stronger than the similar class under the absolute monarchy of France. Adam Smith had avoided arousing antagonism from the land interests, and in turning the aggressive side of the new science against the protective system, he found favor with, rather than excited prejudice among, the cultured class, the only class to which such a book as his could at that time be addressed. Such a class, under the conditions then existing in Great Britain, is apt to feel a contempt tinged with anger for traitors beginning to aspire toward sharing the power and place of born masters of the soil. The larger fact is that Adam Smith, opening the study of political economy at a lower level than the physiocrats, found less resistance, and his book began to secure so permanent a recognition for the new science that its continuance to our time is properly traced to him as its founder, rather than to them. In 1798, 8 years after the author of The Wealth of Nations, lamenting with his last breath that he had done so little, was laid to rest in the Edinburgh Canongate, the English clergyman Malthus brought forward his famous theory of population. This at once, like a long-felt want, took its place in the crystallizing system of political economy which Smith had brought into shape, and which, if it was lacking in a clear and consistent definition of wealth, was not on that account objectionable to the spirit of the learned institutions. A few years after Malthus came Ricardo to correct mistakes into which Smith had fallen as to the nature and cause of rent, and to formulate the true law of rent. But to do this by laying stress on the fact that rent would increase as the necessities of increasing population forced cultivation to less and less productive land, or to lessen less productive points on the same land. When Adam Smith, as though fearful of the radical conclusions to which it must lead, abandoned his true perception that the produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor, he fell into a theory of wages which considered the master as providing from his capital the wages of his workmen. This, together with the theory of the tendency of population to increase faster than subsistence, and the apprehension of the theory of rent as resulting from the forcing of exertion to less and less productive land, became a cardinal doctrine. These, linking with and buttressing each other in what soon became the accepted system of political economy as developed from the Wealth of Nations, did away effectually with any fear that the study of natural laws of the production and distribution of wealth might be dangerous to the great house of Have. In textbooks and teachings from which Adam Smith's recurring perceptions of the natural equality of men were eliminated, it became indeed the dismal science. It was held by its admirers that it needed only to be sufficiently taught them to convince even the lower orders that things as they are things as they ought to be, except perhaps that the monopolizing spirit of merchants and manufacturers and the sneaking arts of underling tradesmen should no longer be permitted to be erected into maxims for governmental interferences with trade. Thus, as the system of political economy presented by Adam Smith began to attract the attention of the thoughtful and cultured, it did not meet the resistance it would have encountered had the special interests which it threatened really been those of the growing class of merchants and manufacturers. On the other hand, the apparent turning of its aggressive side against merchants and manufacturers prevented the powerful landed interest from perceiving fully its relation to their own monopoly until it had gained the weight of recognized philosophic authority. The repeal of the English Corn Laws, passed in Great Britain, was a victory for free trade as far as it was practicable to carry free trade. And in scholastic circles in that country, and in the United States, and throughout the civilized world that took its intellectual impulse from England, it greatly increased the hopefulness of the professed economists. Thus, strengthened by this powerful impulse, there continued to grow up under the sanction and development of a series of able and authoritatively placed men, whose efforts were devoted to smoothing away difficulties and covering up incongruities, an accredited system of political economy, which found its most widely accepted expounder in John Stuart Mill, and reached perhaps its highest point of authority in scholastic circles about, or shortly after the centennial of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. Yet it was as wanting in coherence as the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. It contained much real truth, well worked out. But this was conjoined with fallacies which could not stand examination. The attempt to define its object noun, wealth, and the subterm of wealth, capital, made them much more indefinite and confused than they had been left by Adam Smith, and it was never attempted to bring together what were given as the laws of the distribution of wealth, as that would have shown at a glance their want of relation. This political economy had no real hold on common thought, and was regarded even by ordinarily intelligent men as a scholastic or esoteric science. But it was spoken of by its professors with the utmost confidence as an assured science, and their belief in its success was greatly increased. From the beginning until well past the middle of the 19th century, the temper of the recognized expounders of the political economy, which took shape from Adam Smith's foundation, was hopeful and confident. They believed they had hold of a true science, which needed only development to be universally recognized. Thus, Colonel Torrens, in the introduction to his essay on the production of wealth, says in 1821,
"In the progress of the human mind, a period of controversy among the cultivators of any branch of science must necessarily precede the period of unanimity. With respect to political economy, the period of controversy is passing away, and that of unanimity is rapidly approaching. 20 years hence, there will scarcely exist a doubt respecting any of its fundamental principles."
With the great defeat of protection in 1846, the confidence of political economists became even greater than before. But the predictions that the example of Great Britain in abolishing protective duties would be quickly followed throughout the civilized world were not realized. And fostered by such tremendous political events as the great fight between the American states and the Franco-German War, the wave of reaction in favor of protection seemed to sweep over pretty nearly all the civilized world. And while in the scholastic world, of the English-speaking countries at least, the triumph of Adam Smith's opposition to the principles of the mercantile system seemed to have established firmly an accepted science of political economy, and chairs for its teaching formed an indispensable adjunct of every institution of education, the real incoherencies which had been slurred over began more and more to show themselves. The reason for the constantly increasing confusion in scholastic political economy has lain in the failure of the so-called science to define its subject matter or object noun. Statistics cannot aid us in the search for things until we know what it is we want to find. It is the Tower of Babel all over again. Men who attempt to develop a science of the production and distribution of wealth without first deciding what they mean by wealth cannot understand each other or even understand themselves.